Good morning to our viewers in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. On behalf of Atlantik-Brücke and the American Council on Germany, I'm pleased to welcome you to this installment of the virtual German-American Conference. While we would have preferred to convene in person, we're happy to continue our series of joint online events. After a little bit of a summer break, we're particularly pleased to kick off our fall programming with a discussion about how identity politics has shaped modern political discourse with Dr. Francis Fukuyama and Christiane Hoffmann, both of whom are alumni of our German-American Young Leaders Conference. The political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, hardly needs an introduction. He's a prolific writer and thinker. He has written extensively about international politics. His book, The End of History and the Last Man Standing, was published in 1992 and has appeared in over 20 foreign editions. His most recent book is Identity, The Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. It was published almost exactly 2 years ago on September 11th, 2018, and serves as a jumping off point for today's event. Frank, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And to lead today's discussion, I'm pleased to welcome a foreign policy expert, Christiane Hoffmann. She's the diplomatic correspondent of the German news magazine Spiegel. Before joining Spiegel, she was with the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. She spent 4 years reporting from Moscow in the late 1990s, and then 5 years reporting from Tehran, and recently told me that the topics and issues that Francis Fukuyama has written about have influenced her thinking, particularly in her postings abroad. Christiane, herzlich willkommen.
Thank you, it's a great pleasure.
One last administrative note before we begin. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit your question using the chat function on Zoom. I'll curate the questions and pass them along to Christiane so that she can fold them into the conversation. And with that, Christiane, over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Professor Fukuyama, it is a great honor and a great pleasure to be with you here this afternoon or this morning in the US, and to ask you all the questions I've always wanted to ask, and hopefully also our listeners and have wanted to ask. Steve has been so kind to introduce you already, so let's get started right away. You are one of the most famous political scientists of the world, not least because you have been able to catch or grasp what Germans call the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, several times in your books, with The End of History in 1992, and only 2 years ago with the book on identity politics. And let's start with that right away. Why, at that time, did you think identity politics was an important topic? Why did you choose to write a book on this topic?
Thank you, Christiane. So that's a pretty easy question to answer. It was because Donald Trump was elected in 2016, and then the British voted to leave the European Union that same year. It was clear that there was a populist wave that was striking many countries around the world. In Europe, you had Viktor Orban in Hungary, you had the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and since then you've had populist nationalists appearing in other places, in India under Modi, in Brazil under Bolsonaro. And so there was a global populist upsurge that was, I think, threatening some of the institutional foundations of liberal democracy. And it was doing it in the most developed democracies in the world, in Britain and the United States. So this was obviously a question of some urgency, and it seemed to me, and what I tried to describe in the book was a broad shift in global politics. In the 20th century, the big political divisions were really organized around economic issues. So you had a right that wanted to defend capitalism, free markets, individual freedom, and a left that wanted greater social and economic equality, wanted a strong state in order to redistribute wealth and income. And that was really the fight. You know, you had two extremes of fascism and communism up until the collapse of communism, the defeat of fascism, and then, you know, the world seemed to be split between a kind of center left and center right, but it was still an economic definition of what divided them. But I think in recent years, that axis, economic axis, has been replaced by one around identity. And, you know, I give, in the book, I give a long historical description of where this modern view of identity comes from. It has to do with a belief that one has an inner self that oftentimes is suppressed by the surrounding society, but needs to be recognized. And I actually draw upon my favorite philosopher Hegel, who also understood a lot of historical development as a struggle for recognition. And in this case, it was a recognition of an identity that had been suppressed by elites. It takes a lot of different forms. You know, the first major manifestation was European nationalism in the 19th century. But today it's come back in terms of, you know, on the right, a belief that elites are disregarding, disrespecting ordinary working people. That they've created a globalized world that suits their own interests, but really has not been in the interests of ordinary workers. And I think that it's this sense of disrespect and disenfranchisement that's driven people to vote, you know, for Donald Trump in the United States, for the AfD in Germany, and for other populist leaders around the world.
Well, identity politics used to be the fight for rights for all kinds of minorities. How did it turn out to become a vehicle for populism?
Well, it's correct that, you know, if we use the term identity politics in the American sense, it's really rooted in the politics of progressive people on the left. So this started with a whole series of social movements in the 1960s, the civil rights movement for African Americans, and then feminism, the LGBT rights movement, you know, disabled people. So there, in a liberal society, there are many groups that are marginalized. You know, liberalism is based on a kind of belief in a universal citizenship, but many groups said, no, we're being left out of this. We are not being adequately recognized, respected. Our economic and social status has suffered as a result. And so you had a number of social justice movements that were powered by a genuine belief, a true belief that they were not being included in the society. This began to shift into a different kind of politics by certain interpretations of identity, which said, well, we're not striving actually to be equal in a colorblind liberal society. We're actually distinct as a racial or an ethnic or a religious group, and we want our rights as a member of that group to be respected, and we want you to think about us as primarily members of a group, not members of a kind of universal class of citizens. And so this is one of the ways that left-wing politics evolved. It had been based on the working class in the 20th century, which was really members of the dominant racial and ethnic community. But as time went on, increasingly, what it meant to be progressive meant to be a member of one of these narrower identity groups. And so, for example, in the United States today, the Democratic Party is based on some white progressives, but it's also become very heavily a party of different kinds of minority groups, African Americans, Latinos, gays and lesbians, and so forth. And that shift on the left, I think, has triggered a shift on the right, where the former working class that is, you know, white and the, you know, the formerly dominant cultural group says, hey, what about us? You know, in all of this attention you're giving to minority groups, you've forgotten about us. Our situation has been bad as a result of globalization. So there's conspiracy between these minorities, between foreigners, and these elites that profit from those groups. And that, I think, has set up the kind of bitter polarization that affects, many societies, many rich democracies today.
Your book has been published almost 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago. It's 2 years is an eternity by today's standards of history and politics. Where do you think you have been proven right with your book? Where have you been proven wrong, if anywhere? And what has struck or surprised you in the development since then?
Yeah, so I think it depends on what country you're in, but it seems to me that the basic argument I was making has been, in a way, demonstrated by, for example, the responses to the COVID epidemic. And certainly in the United States, we are completely immersed in identity politics today. The division, between red and blue Americans was getting deeper, and in the 4 years of Donald Trump's administration has just taken on dimensions that I think are really unbelievable. Wearing masks, for example, has become an identity statement. So if you like Donald Trump, you don't wear a mask, and if you hate Donald Trump, you do wear a mask. It has nothing to do with public health or any kind of rational, understanding of epidemics or measures to combat them. It's really a statement that you belong to this political tribe. I think that, as you probably followed, it's very, very worrisome in the United States. We always had this racial identity issue because of the long history of slavery and then of racial segregation in the United States. We thought that we had overcome a lot of that with the election of Obama twice as president of the United States, but that racial divide has deepened. And I think for the United States, at least, this is not true in most European countries, but for our country, this identity divide has now taken on a racial characteristic. And you have a president of the United States who is a racist. I mean, there's just no other way of describing him. And every hardcore racist in the country thinks that Donald Trump is his or her champion. So in that sense, the crisis has really deepened, and it's completely hobbled the American effort to deal with the pandemic, because the medical and behavioral response has been completely politicized by this fundamental identity division.
Yeah, if you could elaborate a bit more on how identity politics actually plays in the current election campaign. I mean, Democrats have been reproached in the 2016 elections that by concentrating on identity politics, they actually paved the way for Trump's election victory. Do you feel that, do you share this criticism, and do you feel that they have learned their lesson? Has anything changed?
Well, it's very complicated. In the midst of the pandemic, on May 25th, George Floyd was killed by a policeman in Minneapolis, right? So an African American. This triggered a huge protest movement around the country. I mean, in my own university, my own students, were just unbelievably upset and angry that this had happened. And it led to, a whole series of protests in even small cities around the country, hundreds of protests in favor of Black Lives Matter. And then some of those protests turned into riots, and some of them led to substantial destruction of property and businesses and so forth. And this recently, occurred, well, in Portland. These protests were going on ever since May. In Kenosha, Wisconsin, there was a particularly bad incident where another African American was shot by the police. This led to rioting and destruction of businesses. And I think that Trump saw this as a big opportunity to shift the discussion away from his incompetent handling of the pandemic to law and order. You know, he had campaigned in 2016 on the theme of American carnage. He said that American cities were becoming hellholes of rising crime. It was completely false. You know, there's just no empirical evidence that this was true, but that's what he claimed, and it was appealing to enough voters in swing states that it managed to push him over the line. And right now he's trying to do the same thing. He's trying to say that, you know, life will be a hellscape if Biden is elected, because Democratic mayors will allow protesters and rioters to, you know, run rampant and destroy businesses and come and attack you in your suburban homes. You know, he, at the Republican convention, he put on this couple that had come out onto their front porch, you know, bearing guns, you know, during a Black Lives Matter protest. And, you know, so he's trying to use this theme to win back support. Whether this works, we just don't know. I think there's a lot of fear, you know, among the Democrats that he would pull this off a second time. Right now, the polls don't indicate that he's been all that successful, but that's certainly the strategy that I think he will employ up until November 3rd.
At this point, I think it would be good to add a viewer question. And one of our viewers is asking, assuming that Joe Biden wins the election and that he attracts many of the white working class men that had been among Trump's supporters, is it possible that the Democratic Party can become even more diverse? And let me add one more question, just out of curiosity. If you could tell us who is going to win, that would be just great.
Yeah, well, I wish I knew. So I think that Biden will have a lot of trouble governing if he is elected, and it depends a little bit on the scenario. The worst scenario is if he becomes president, but the Republicans continue to hold the Senate. And, you know, I was recently in a kind of gaming exercise where we tried to work through different election outcome scenarios. And that's not a very attractive one, because the Republicans are not going to abandon Trump and Trumpism if they lose the presidency. You know, there's every indication that they'll blame it on, you know, bad tactics and not getting their message out adequately and so forth. And the Senate, the Republican Senate, will continue to act as a veto on anything that Biden wants to do. And so the polarization,
pretty much like Obama's times.
like yes. Obama's last 6 years, you know, and then you're tempted to do things through executive orders. And so, I mean, this is a problem with the presidential system in general. So that's not so good. But even if Biden and the Democrats take both the House, the Senate, and the presidency, there is this division in the Democratic Party. And so you have a progressive wing that had been led by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. They've been holding their noses, you know, voting for Biden. They never really liked him all that much. And I think that if there is this big sweep, that those progressives are going to demand, you know, that their agenda be moved up, and there'll be a lot of pressure on Biden to do things that, you know, that they want. And you know, and part of that agenda is, you know, a deepening of identity politics. Part of it is economic in terms of Medicare for all and so forth. And so there's going to be a big fight within the Democratic Party. So that's, you know, I think what the future holds. And I think it's disturbing, because the United States is not going to return to the Obama years, you know, simply by electing Joe Biden. As to the question of who's going to win the election, you know, the polls that came out after the Republican convention, when Trump was deep into this narrative about declining law and order, actually didn't, you know, in some swing states he started to do a little bit better, and so the margin narrowed. The latest polls have still shown a remarkable consistency that virtually no new information that comes on the scene shifts people's view of either Biden or Trump terribly much, which is good for Biden because he was ahead pretty substantially. In the last 2 weeks, we've had a new conversation, first about all these disparaging things that Trump said about, dead American soldiers, and then most recently, just beginning yesterday, with this new Bob Woodward book, where he is quoted on tape as saying that he understood how deadly the pandemic was, but didn't want to inform Americans. So he caught in a pretty overt lie. We don't know, how this is going to, previous revelations like this haven't really shaken the support of his core supporters.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you. That what's so striking from our view, from Europe, is that there's this sort of stable support of 40% for him, regardless of lies, regardless of how badly he handles the economy or the COVID crisis. How can you explain that?
Well, so I really do think this is why this identity explanation is powerful. I think that is the explanation, that people are not rationally assessing either policies or character, in their choice for who's president. They are lining up according to these basic identities because they want their team to win, and they'll accept lying and cheating and all sorts of things. So one of the big issues right now is actually can the United States hold a fair election? And
exactly.
A lot of Republicans have been doing everything they can to make sure that Democratic voters don't vote. And so Trump, for the last several months, has been waging this scorched earth campaign to try to discredit mail-in balloting. It's an obvious thing that you have to do during a pandemic, and yet he says this is going to lead to massive fraud and foreign interference. All of this is just total nonsense, but he basically wants to reduce the number of, Democratic voters. And, I think one thing that a lot of people are really worried about after November 3rd is the following scenario, where Trump is actually ahead in the vote count on Election Day, on November 3rd, but then there's a blue mail-in wave where mail-in votes get progressively counted, and then balance shifts to Biden. And at this point, the Republicans are going to do everything they can to try to discount mail-in votes. They're going to contest, whether they're mailed, under the right circumstances, whether they're fraudulent, and there's just going to be litigation and fights in, 50 states over just counting the votes. And it could lead to, situations of deadlock where you have dual slates of electors that are proposed, in December or January. And so I don't know, it's a kind of nightmare situation.
This is actually a possible civil war scenario, is it?
Well, that's another issue. There's increasing levels of, I would say, and this is what I was saying over the summer, it was kind of surprising that given how passionate the two sides are, that there hadn't been more violence up till now. And now we're beginning to see it. We're seeing it on the left with the riots that have occurred, and we're now seeing it on the right with these militias turning up at protest rallies to supposedly defend property. And now, a couple of people have been killed on both sides. And you can imagine in a contested election, with the stakes as high as it is for both sides, that it wouldn't take much to trigger much more widespread violence. And that's something I think that we're quite worried about right now.
One of our viewers is asking of what will happen to liberal democracy in the US if Trump actually wins again?
Yeah, this is something I really hate to think about because, there's three things that are, in my view, disqualifying for Trump. The first has to do with policies, tax cuts and Supreme Court appointments and so forth. So that's the usual partisan, divide. That I think is not actually the most important set of issues. There's a second and third category of threats that he poses to the American system. The second one are institutions, and most importantly, the rule of law. he has no concept of what the rule of law means. He thinks, it's just people obeying the law, like protesters shouldn't be allowed to, damage private property. And that's really not the deepest sense of the rule of law, because in that sense, China has the rule of law. Cuba, North Korea, they all are rule of law states if it just means no violent protest. The deepest meaning of the rule of law, comes out of this English tradition where the king must be under the law. The king cannot violate the law. And in the present circumstance, that means the president cannot violate the law. And that's something that Trump has no concept of. He told life has thought of the law as a tool that he can use to advance his private interests. So he'll sue business partners, competitors, contractors in order to win advantage. And then he will try to shield his family and himself from any legal accountability. And this, he's gotten now an attorney general that is on board with this agenda. And so he's trying to do everything he can to avoid this sort of legal accountability. And so I think this is the central institution that has been weakened already and will be weakened in a second term. The third basket of problems are normative, because a lot of politics actually depends not on formal institutions as defined in constitutions and laws, but the expectation that people have for behavior of leaders. And there's this hope that seems very naive now, given the reality that we're facing, but that leaders, someone like a president, should be a unifying leader and should represent the country. I think in Germany, you have that system still. You should hang on to it. Prime minister represents a party or a coalition, but the president represents the country as a whole. And I think most German presidents have been pretty good at playing that role. In the United States, that was an expectation we had, but now it's gone. And I think that, Trump basically sees the presidency and power. It's not that he even sees this as a means of furthering Republican policy interests, which is the traditional way that many presidents have seen the office, but he sees this as a way of advancing his own personal interests. And this, I think, is extremely destructive. And a lot of politicians all over the country are beginning to imitate him in that sense. And so that's what I think will deepen. So just to get back to the policies, there's lots of things that'll be very bad. I mean, John Bolton has said that he doesn't think that NATO is going to survive a second Trump term. He, I think, pretty clearly, personally, would like to withdraw from NATO. I don't think that he's figured out quite how to do this in his first term. But if he's reelected, I think he'll see that as a mandate to do that. Every American ally in the world should be really, really worried if he gets reelected, because I think he'll be unleashed all of his instincts, on Russia, which is particularly bizarre. He's just not the only person in the country that actually has a very favorable view of Russia. What that will mean for the relationship with Europe and geopolitics is really scary to imagine. So I think those will be some of the consequences of a Trump re-election.
In this regard, I find one of the questions that the viewers are sending here very interesting, and that is talking about shared facts, about the rationality as a basis for politics and society, as very important basics. And our viewers are asking, do you think American institutions can survive if the country cannot return to shared facts? Can military, law enforcement, bureaucracy, and judiciary fulfill their purpose and stabilize democracy if the people making up these institutions have to live in a country so divided on what is actually true?
Well, this is a problem, I think, that's deeper than just the United States. I think the rise of the internet has really created a world in which all of the hierarchical structures that we created to process and interpret data, and that means publishers, newspapers, editors, fact checkers, other institutions like governments that produce, statistical data, all of these have been weakened by the fact that anyone can publish anything they want on the internet, and they have been taking advantage of that. And in fact, they've been weaponizing that. And this is a problem now that exists in many polarized countries where you don't simply have policy differences, you have different interpretations of reality that are out there that have been gaining, increasing traction. It's particularly bad in the United States. We've been having this kind of, among social scientists, this debate whether the technology has been driving the polarization or the polarization is just, adding to the technology. And that's really not very clear, but, we are in this situation where there is this fundamental difference, divergence, and until you restore the legitimacy and the credibility of a lot of those institutions that mediate between, reality and the way we interpret reality, you're going to be in a continuing problem. Now, in general, I do think that there's a way out of the broad polarization, and that's through politics. That we still have, unfortunately, the institution of an election. And I think that if the Democrats win pretty decisively in the November election, and then they keep winning down the road, then it's going to shift the incentives of other politicians who will realize that Trump has led the Republican Party into a total dead end. And at that point, you might start, rebuilding the credibility of more centrist kinds of institutions. But that's going to take a long time, and I don't think we're going to be out of this, current problem anytime soon.
Well, one of the viewers is asking, and this is very much related to what you've said just now, so I want to drop it in here. He's asking, what does a post-Trump Republican Party look like? What holds the party together other than resentments of the liberal elites?
That's another issue that's been strongly debated among some of my Republican friends. I think that there will not be a quick repudiation of Trump and Trumpism. I think, and this is just drawn from observation of other losing parties, other parties that have lost elections. You usually have to lose 2 or 3 elections pretty decisively before it sinks in that the problem was not just a tactical one, but a strategic one about your basic message, and that you have been delivering the wrong message to the wrong group of people. So I would expect that even a pretty big defeat of Trump in November is not immediately going to shift the Republican Party. It's still going to be Trump's party. He certainly will continue to criticize, whoever suggests that he was the wrong candidate or they have the wrong message, and that's going to continue. And he's got a big family. He's got all these children that obviously are lining up to succeed him. You've got news commentators, other Republicans that imitate him and will carry on his banner, and so that's going to be a fight that will continue for some time. I do think that in the longer run, if the problem they face is that their demographic base is shrinking. It's shrinking year by year because they appeal to older voters, they appeal to less educated, more rural ones, and that part of the population gets smaller every year. In fact, that's one of the sources of fear on their part, is that they look at these long-term demographic trends and they realize that they're going to be a permanent minority party, and that's why they're trying to disqualify Democratic voters and so forth. But I think those realities will kick in, at a certain point. There will have to be a reckoning whether Trump has led them into a complete dead end in terms of their electability. But it is going to take several years for this to play out.
If you look at other parts of the world, let's go away a little from the US. How does identity politics play there? I mean, there's a lot of European societies that are almost as polarized as the US. I'm thinking about Poland, maybe even Turkey, but others like Germany are a lot less polarized. How do you make that? What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I think you're very lucky that you've escaped this sort of thing. I think that part of the reason that my identity book caught on in Germany was it was just when the AfD was appearing. And I think there was a lot of fear that Germany could go down a similar road that the United States and Britain had gone down with the rise of this national populist right. And so far that hasn't happened. And I think that allows, your country and, a lot of Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands and so forth, to maintain, a degree of social consensus around the legitimacy of their mainstream parties, even though they've been weakened substantially in recent years, and of their institutions. So like public broadcasters, are still credible, and although there's been criticism from the extreme right of ZDF or the BBC or other, broadcasters, it's not the same as in the United States where, the right and the left listen to completely different sources for news and information and facts and this sort of thing. And that's partly, there are a lot of different sources of it. I think that there's a kind of strong state tradition in Northern Europe, less patronage, more belief in institutions. And then there's good performance. I think that, COVID is very interesting in that respect because there's a feedback loop between bad policy and bad results that becomes very obvious to people quickly, which is not true in other policy areas. And so if you screw up in foreign policy or in education or, other areas, you may not see a bad result appearing for years. Whereas in COVID, if you have a bad response, all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, the death rates start going up or the infection rates start going up. And people can see that there's a connection between bad leadership and bad outcomes. And I think that this has played out in the United States. Trump's popularity really began to decline very dramatically when, the COVID epidemic and the bad results started to come in. And one thing that I think people don't recognize is the role of COVID in putting pressure on Lukashenko in Belarus, because
very true, very interesting.
He was, he was denying, just like Trump, that this was a serious epidemic. He wasn't taking measures to fight the disease, and people could see that that was having bad results. And I suspect that you would not see these kinds of mass demonstrations against him had it not been for the epidemic. And so the fact that I think most of Northern Europe succeeded in dealing with the pandemic, reasonably well, increased the legitimacy of governments there, and that's one of the reasons I think that you've been able to avoid some of the polarization that we've seen in the U.S.
I think you could even argue that in a country like Germany, COVID has diminished polarization because it has increased so much the support for the government, and the society is a lot less divided on COVID than it was on an issue like migration.
Yes, that's a positive feedback loop. I think that good policy actually reduces polarization and then makes good policy more possible in the future. We, on the other hand, are stuck in this very destructive negative feedback loop where, polarization leads to bad policy, which makes outcomes worse, which makes people madder and increases polarization. So you should be, you should be happy to hold on to what, the situation that you're in.
One of our viewers is asking as to how much Trump's disregard of liberal norms has actually fueled illiberal movements in Europe.
That's something that you are going to have to tell me because I'm not allowed to come to Europe. So I read about it. I mean, there was a piece in the New York Times a couple of days ago about how popular Trump was among AfD supporters. I mean, there's always been a kind of illiberal international. Trump's former campaign manager, Steve Bannon, was going around Europe before he was arrested, trying to build ties between all of the populist parties in Europe and his own movement. And I think that that's succeeded to some extent, although I think that it's limited by the fact that a lot of populists and ordinary people in Europe also don't like the United States. And they don't necessarily, they may agree on certain aspects of the populist agenda, opposition to immigration and this sort of thing, but they don't really like the idea that they're joining a kind of American-led club. And I think that's probably limited the appeal, in Germany and France and other European countries. But like I said, you're going to have to tell me since I'm not there.
We have some readers asking about the connection between economic politics or economy and identity politics. And I would like to add two questions here. And one is, could an aggressive economic resurgence dampen the role of identity politics? That's with regard also to the COVID situation or the economic development after COVID, I think. And another viewer writes, it seems that there is an increasing movement to demonize those who are more well-off. This is part of creating in-out groups. Is this a new wave of Marxism?
So there's definitely a connection between economic inequality and the rise of populist movements. I think that the reason that populism appeared strongly on the world scene in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century is that globalization had, over the previous 20 years, increased levels of inequality, and in particular had undermined undermined is a little bit too strong, but many working class people felt threatened by globalization because they saw their jobs being exported to Asia and to other parts of the developing world. They were not benefiting from the advances of globalization. They felt competition from immigrants and outsiders that were below them. However, what was interesting, I think, about the interpretation of that was that it was the right that capitalized on that and not the left. It could have been the left. It could have been traditional socialist or left-wing parties saying, yes, the capitalists are doing this to you. We have a solution, which is, kind of a traditional, left-wing one of taxing rich people, of redistributing, building, a stronger central state to equalize outcomes. But instead, a lot of these working class voters went to right-wing populist parties that had a different agenda, which said, the way to solve your economic problem is to keep foreigners out and to stop outsourcing and pursue this economic nationalist agenda. And they were much stronger, at least in the first few years. Now, I think what's happening is there's a kind of action-reaction cycle where the kind of extreme voices on either side begin to stimulate one another. And so in the United States, for example, Bernie Sanders was really not primarily about identity politics. He really was a very traditional kind of social democrat that wanted, higher taxation in order to support more generous social programs. And he has definitely gotten more popular in the, he not popular enough to win the nomination, but he now represents a pretty significant wing of the Democratic Party. And so there is this growing radicalization of certain economic views. Now, the thing that I find a little bit disturbing is that many people under the age of 30 in the United States have a completely different life experience than I do. was very much shaped by the Cold War and by the experience of communism. And I have a pretty good understanding of why centralized planning and centralized economies don't work very well. And I think that, you know, people under 30 have no direct experience of that. And so that's why the word socialism has come back in the United States. I mean, Sanders was the one that began using the word socialism. Actually, for people in his generation, it's got very negative connotations because it reminds them of, you know, the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But I think for younger people, they say, oh, free college education, if that's socialism, then that's what I want. And that's why I think there's been this shift. And also, you know, capitalism has not been performing all that well. It's created this layer of oligarchs who use their economic power to influence politics. You know, there's a lot of corporate misbehavior that was made especially evident during the financial crises, you know, that began in 2008. So there's a lot of reason, you know, I think a lot of justified reasons why people think differently about economics than they did, you know, 10 years ago.
Some of our viewers, thank you so far. It has been very interesting, everything you have said, I think. Some of our viewers are now asking about the role of media in identity politics. Are they actually deepening the divide because they have to feed news 24/7, or how do you see the role of the media?
I think the media landscape has changed a lot. I think that criticism of the media that they, well, so it's true that they do focus on less important issues because they want to keep that 24-hour news cycle going. But there's been a much deeper criticism and division within the media that really has intensified with Trump, which is the view that the entire mainstream media is so biased and so hopelessly, you know, pro the left that nothing they say should be believed or is credible, and that's what's contributed to this alternative fact universe.
Do you agree? Do they have a point?
Well, so, you know, like many criticisms that are made by Trump and his followers, there is certainly a grain of truth in that, right? I mean, I find it actually sort of hard to read the New York Times every morning because, you know, they make their political preferences so clear. You know, it's not that they put forward false facts knowing that they're false, but, you know, it really has to do with the kinds of issues that they cover and the way they, you know, interpret things, their headlines. So there's no question, there's a lot of media bias. And so there was there was more than a grain of truth in that. But, you know, as in most things, Trump starts out with, you know, it's just like with China policy. I mean, I actually agree with certain things in his China policy, but he carries it out in such a way that, you know, it makes it really pretty hard to support the policy as it's actually implemented. So the same is true with the media, that it's not true that everything that comes out or is published in a mainstream media source is ipso facto false or fake news. And I think we've got this deeper problem, you know, that is really caused by the internet, where you get these very extreme views and really false facts that start in the periphery of that media universe, meaning on not even on Twitter and Facebook, but on 4chan or 8chan or some of these, you know, more restricted kinds of platforms. And in other countries, by the way, this is going on these encrypted platforms like WhatsApp or Telegram, where nobody actually can get into the inside and see what's happening. So extremist views start in the periphery, and then they tend to get picked up by the mainstream media and then propagated to the rest of the media ecosystem. So I think that this is a new phenomenon that we're really not that familiar in dealing with. And unfortunately, you know, in many developing countries, this has actually become a very serious problem in places like the Philippines or India. or Ukraine, you have these internet voices that are amplified by traditional media that are oftentimes backed by, hostile foreign powers that have really poisoned a lot of the political discourse.
I find it very interesting, being a media person, this question of whether the media actually should give up their objective role or their objectivity, because it is a situation where you have to resist. It is about resistance. It's not my opinion, but I can understand what this discussion is all about. And I think this leads to the broader question of, how can we fight this? You've spoken about a possible election victory of Biden. This would be a first step, but we're talking about a much broader problem that is not solved by one election, not at all. So what is the way out? How can we return to rationalism, to universal values? How can we return to a common middle ground and to the foundations that are actually necessary for democracy?
I don't have an answer to that, certainly not a clear one. I do think in general that the media needs to not give up on this ideal of objectivity that really made a professional journalist a professional journalist.
Absolutely, I agree.
I think that the moment that happens, then every negative thing that's said about the media becomes truer and truer, that it's just a weapon that's being used by one side or the other. I think that it's important for the media to actually scrutinize itself, because there are biases. There are very clear biases in the way that it reports news. Again, with the mainstream media, it's not so much that they actually make up untrue stories or they propagate things that they know are untrue. It really has to do with much more subtle things about what they choose to cover. And I'll just give you an example of this from several years ago. I remember having a discussion with kind of a right-wing, Trump supporter, and this was in the aftermath of the Syrian civil war and the refugee crisis in Europe and so forth. And there's this famous front page picture of a dead child that had washed up on a beach. And I remember this person reacting to that and saying, look, the only reason that this picture was published in the New York Times was that the people behind the Times want us to intervene in Syria. That's the reason that picture is there. They could have put a picture from the Congo or from India or from any number of other places, but they picked this because they've got a hidden policy agenda. And so it wasn't that the picture was false or doctored or photoshopped. It was a real picture of a real child representing real suffering. But that's bias as opposed to fake news. And I do think that it's important, that the media understand that there's lots of ways that its own preferences get reflected in the way that it reports things. And if you let that get out of hand, then you're going to lose credibility with important audiences.
Professor Fukuyama, thank you very, very much. So far, we have come to the closing question already. And this question is my question, but also some viewers have asked this question, and you've certainly heard it a lot of times. It's the question about the end of history. Do you still think that the thesis of your book has proven right? Or do you feel that you have to model it, or that maybe even it turned out to be wrong? And what do you make of this?
Well, so, this really depends on properly understanding what my original thesis was. The thesis was really one about modernization, and it comes directly from Hegel and then later from Marx, who both had theories of modernization that said that societies have a slow, centuries-long evolution through different political and economic forms. And then the question at the end of history is really, where does that modernization process terminate? if it terminates at all. Hegel's answer was it terminates in a kind of bourgeois rule of law liberal state, and Marx's answer was that it terminates in communism. And what I was arguing back in 1989 was that it looked like the Hegelian version was going to be more correct than the Marxist version, that we weren't going to evolve into a higher state of social organization, but that something like liberal democracy was as good as we were going to get. So the question at the end of history is not will stuff happen or will democracies be challenged or so forth. The question was always, is there a kind of higher stage of social evolution that we can look forward to? Is there an alternative model? And what I've said for the last 20, 25 years is that, really the only serious challenger at this point is China, because they've got an authoritarian capitalist, semi-capitalist model that looks pretty successful. And we'll have to see whether that's a sustainable model or not. But short of that, I didn't really see alternate. I don't think Viktor Orban's Hungary is the answer to the end of history. I mean, I don't think we're evolving into that kind of a political system. And so that's really the question I was trying to pose, and I still think it's unanswered.
But isn't the question whether the Hegelian model of thinking of history, about history, is right at all? Whether history does have an aim where we are going, that history is sort of a direction of improving the state of mankind, or are we rather going in circles?
Well, I think I've done a lot of my work over the last 20 years in developing countries that are poor and chaotic and have very poor state institutions. And I think that the people that ask this question or pose the possibility that maybe we're just going in circles, I don't think they've spent a lot of time, in Guatemala or rural parts of India or many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where life expectancies are still, what they had been in Europe before the Industrial Revolution, where most of your children are going to die before their 5th birthday, this kind of situation. And I think it's reflected in the fact that people around the world, millions of people want to leave those kinds of societies, pre-modern, unmodernized societies, and move to rich countries because, so many aspects of life, both economic and political, are better. And so I think that's fundamentally the answer. If you say, has there been progress? Yes, I think there's obviously been progress. Is it linear, and is it always onwards and upwards? No, we have huge setbacks, and I think right now we're going through a big challenge and setback to global democracy. But I do think that the overall trajectory is still there.
I love this note to end the discussion, because it's still somewhat optimistic. We've heard a lot of gloomy analysis from you, but we've also heard some more positive outlook, even for the US election. Thank you so much, and over to Stephen.
Well, Francis and Christiane, you both covered a lot of ground, and you've given us a lot of food for thought. On behalf of Atlantik-Brücke and the American Council on Germany, I want to thank you both so much for this rich and very nuanced conversation. I also want to thank our viewers for great questions. We tried to include as many as we could as possible, and Christiane, you did a wonderful job of folding those in. But Francis, our debt of gratitude goes to you for just this wide-ranging conversation. Whenever I hear you speak, I feel like we're only touching the tip of the iceberg, and that there's so much more that we could talk about. So I look forward to continued dialogue and engagement with you. So thank you both
very much. Thanks for
very much. Thanks for our viewers, and until next time, stay well, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.